Hey, family, I am Mark. Welcome to the Kinship Collective. We are ending otherness. We believe that if we celebrate one another's stories and as we reimagine scripture together, that we'll create a sense of solidarity and togetherness that means everything. It can transform everything. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Today, we are joined by an incredible human being. To me, he represents commitment to community. He represents advocacy and solidarity, wisdom, grace to self. I really appreciate and inspired by our guest today. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Johnson. Eric, welcome, welcome, man. What did I miss? What did I miss?
Oh, just being in the room where it happens, brother. So,
You come on.
man, man, what an amazing day! I was so glad that you got to be a part of that earlier because it wasn't that I was on pins and needles,
Mm-hmm.
um, but when you start speaking truth, um,
Mm,
one of the things that I've learned is that if there's such a thing as a superpower, my story is my superpower. I can use that to humanize the room,
mm-hmm.
so that um, when those little swords come out, um, everyone knows that what I'm doing is I'm cutting something away that's harmful. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
coming to harm you.
Mm,
So I'm coming from a place of love, and so I realized before I even hit the things that we may, talk about today, that that I needed to start with something from my story that would humanize the room, so they knew that I was not on the attack,
mm,
that those my words could be heard.
mm, mm. Eric, I so appreciate that. We've had other conversations where you talked about your superpower is vulnerability.
Yes.
And that's always interesting to me because I don't think it's a superpower. I think you've practiced that muscle of the courageous muscle of being willing to go into a place that many people maybe haven't done the work to go, aren't healed enough to go, but you're willing to go there. And so earlier today, Eric and I were in a meeting in our community, and there's all kinds of leaders in the space. And Eric shared um, about some of the challenged history of the church as it relates to people of color, and I'm hoping we can get into some of that here too to celebrate Black History Month and kind of get to some of the roots of why some people have a difficult time vibing with the church, especially around issues of race. And I thought that some of the stories that you share were just incredible. They were super moving, and it was interesting to see how the Zoom room responded to that truth also.
Mm. Yes. Yeah. So, where do you want to start?
I want to start with Elizabeth Key.
Okay.
Maybe that's a step too far back. Um,
Well, we could let's start with John Punch and go to
yes,
Elizabeth.
let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Um, to understand where our nation is now, um, because the, there are terms and phrases, and I'm not apologizing for any of these, nor am I using them as a weapon. Um, but I understand that if we want forward movement, you have to know how to turn enemies into allies, and
Mm,
the only way that that is going to happen is what I said earlier about humanizing the room and then bringing understanding in a gracious way, um, so
mm,
that people understand that um, you're taking the thorn out of the paw because you're in pain, not because I'm coming to harm you. So if we're going to have this, if we're if I started this off by saying, let's talk about what's wrong with the church. Let's talk about the history of racism in the church. Oh, you know, back off. Nope, nope. There's already some shutdown. Um, but if you start, um, which is why I started with a little bit about my story about um, recognizing that for so long in my life, without even realizing it, that I was a captive, that I was a slave to perceptions. Um, when in my quiet time, God spoke to me and said, Eric, you are my beautiful boy. I'm so proud of you. And I burst into tears because I realized what God was saying. There was no doubt what God was telling me. He was telling me, you see yourself as a beautiful person, internally, but you don't see yourself as a person of beauty externally. I I didn't even realize I was living in that untruth until that
Mm.
very moment, and it was so clear to me. And I then my question was, how did I get here? What were what are the things from my past that clouded my perceptions, and what else is in the driver's seat of my perceptions? And this is how I approach the 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 topic of equity, which is a um, which is the needed conversation. And so we have to go back to those origins. And so it all starts back in 1640. Uh,
Mm.
an indentured servant that was African by the name of John Punch uh, was uh, dealing with the abuse of not slavery at the time yet, but still um, very demeaning, dehumanizing indentured servitude. And there were others. And something to understand about the colonies at that time, that there were so many people of different national origins, and that's important. I Up until this point, I don't want to talk about race because race was something that didn't exist at that time.
Mm.
People were identified by their nation of origin. So you were African, you were uh, Irish, you were a Dutchman. All right. So when John Punch uh, flees, he flees with two of his comrades who were also desiring to escape this injustice. They were all equals, they were all suffering equally. And so John runs off with an Irishman and a Dutchman, and they are immediately caught. And when they are brought before court, the Irishman and the Dutchman are each sentenced to serve an additional 5 years of indentured servanthood. But John Punch was sentenced to serve his master for the rest of his life.
Mm.
The first case, and when I say case, I mean not example of slavery, because there was slavery that was already existing at the time, but this was a court case. This is where the law showed favoritism and made a statement. You three may come from equal circumstances, but you three are not equal.
Mm.
And it sends a message, and it builds a multi class coalition against Africans. So, what does everybody not want to be? I don't want to be an African.
Mm-hmm.
And now this case provides precedent for legalized slavery. that
Mm-hmm.
that if you are African, you will be an indentured servant for the rest of your life, and your children and your children's children will be born into this.
Mm.
Uh, which leads us to the next case in the mid 1600s, Elizabeth Key.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth Key uh, is the byproduct of, and all of this takes place in Virginia. Um, the House of Burges was the first legislative um, organization in the colonies. All right. So when you're talking about the law, the legislative body that existed was in Virginia. All right. So the John Punch case takes place in Virginia. Elizabeth Key, uh, she is the byproduct of an Englishman um, uh, uh, and a female slave. All right. She's therefore born into slavery, um, and her father uh, makes the wish of um, of her master that he wants her to be released from slavery at the age of 15, and the slave master says no. Um, and you have to understand also that in terms of adulthood, 16 is the age. Um, and so she ends up marrying an indentured servant who has a background in law, and they go to court and sue for her right to be freed. And her case is that one, she is the daughter, and according to English courts, um, the issue of the rights of the child come from the father. All right. So the father determines that. So if the father is free, then the daughter should be free. All right. So she sues on that right. And then on the other is that she is now a Christian. And under English common law, no Christian can be made a slave. And so the courts rule in her favor, and she is set free. But of course, this creates complete total uproar within the colonies, because they needed um, a labor force, and they didn't want anything to interfere with that. And so when this case was won, um, landowners, slave masters, immediately stopped, watch this, immediately stopped um, baptizing their slaves and sharing anything in regards to Christianity
Mm.
until
Mm.
the Virginia legislature in, I believe, 1666 passed a law that the determination of rights will now come from the mother, not the father. And so this meant that because we're talking about the ruling class, we're talking about the higher echelon of men, can have their way with any woman, especially their slaves, produce a child, and that child can no longer be set free from slavery because of the father or because they are a Christian. Once that law was passed, slave owners, these property owners, went back to sharing the Blessed Sacrament and the practice of baptism.
Mm.
This is this is the betrayal of the deepest held tenet of our faith, the Imago Dei, that in Genesis, where it said that we are made in the likeness and image of God. And because we are made in the likeness and image of God, then we are worthy of love. We are worthy of equity. We are worthy of justice. We are worthy of community. We are not property. We are the image of God. And uh, through sometimes I just hear people make these statements like, oh, when you talk about justice, that's a social gospel. No, justice, every Jew, Jesus was a Jew. Every Jew understood this. They understood that justice was a part of the Imago Dei. So when in Isaiah, and is there, should I just go ahead and just
Go
read?
ahead. Absolutely.
So in Isaiah, let's start with Isaiah 61, verse 1.
Mhm.
The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. All right. What happens in Luke chapter 4? Jesus reads this very passage, and he says, "This day, this passage is fulfilled in your midst." Well, when you read further in Isaiah 61, I believe it's somewhere around verse 8, what does it say? I, the Lord, love justice.
Mm.
Jesus, Jesus is the embodiment of that. When Jesus talks about who truly represents his kingdom, he gives the parable of the sheep and goats. And who are the sheep? The very ones that do this work that is outlined in Isaiah. What was Jesus's indictment on the goats? He said, you didn't visit me in prison when I was sick, when I was homeless, when I had no clothing, when I was hungry. What is that? That is an indictment on justice. The great commandment, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Mhm.
Well, How do we love our neighbor as ourselves? What does that look like? It looks like the Imago Dei. If I understand that I am made in the image and likeness of God, and so is everyone else, then I am to love my neighbor as the likeness and image of God. So now we go back to these decisions that were made, and we see a violation of the greatest commandment. Um, the thing I didn't say today, but if we're going to just take it a step further,
Come on.
is when we we're in 1683, and the House of Burgesses convene over property. Who, because Virginia is now parceling out property, 50 acres of land. Who is going to get that property? Well, we know it's going to be defined as men, but we just can't say Europeans. We have to dictate who these individuals are. And this is where the creation of white happens in the colonies. That if you are white, then you have advantages, you have privileges. Um, but there's also something that you lose. And this is, I didn't say this earlier, but this is important to note. When you become white, you give up your culture. You're no longer you gave up, because now you're no longer identified by your nation of origin. You are no longer identified by your religion. You are now identified by a construct called race. You're identified as white. And if you are poor, and if you are the working class, you want to participate in that advantage. And so you become white, no longer a Scotsman, no longer an Irishman. You become white. No longer European, you become white. And the goal at that point is, if I want to survive, if I want to, and bear in mind, everyone was not treated equally when you are white. The poor and the middle class are going to participate, but just enough to create allegiance to the upper class, but no allegiance to their fellow non-white compadres that are suffering the same thing. All right. So, I mean, if we're doing the math on this, and we're still in Virginia, well, then let's talk about the Virginian Thomas Jefferson, the Saxon. And so he writes our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, and we find these amazing words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds beautiful. It sounds like the Imago Dei, but it's not. It's a form of godliness, but it denies the power thereof. Because all men is not all men. We have created something, and I'd say we, our this ruling class has created a definition of who those men are. Isn't this what George Orwell was trying to warn us in the book Animal Farm? We read that book. It became so clear to me, the message that George Orwell was trying to get across, that that the farm animals no longer want to be slaughtered, no longer want to be murdered. They no longer want their children to be taken away. And so they take over the farm, and they make this alliance, and their first tenet is that all animals are created equal. But then the pigs are smarter than anyone else, and they become the ruling class. And eventually that changes to all animals are created equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This is our Constitution. This is our Declaration of Independence. And if we this is like the Matrix, when all of a sudden I took the pill, and all of a sudden I woke up and realized just how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Um, this is the understanding that if I stand on context, these documents are not for me. I have to stand on the greater law. I have to stand on the greater principle, and that is biblically the Imago Dei. But the reason why I point all of these things out is that before the foundation of the United States of America, the church was complicit in betraying the very tenets of God.
Mm.
And we see that complicity throughout history. We think it just started after slavery or during the civil rights movement or during Jim Crow. No, that the church's complicity in this has been from the beginning. And that's not to say that there were not, if I can say this in the words of Stan Lee, true believers. There were true believers. There was the Mennonite church that was against this all along. They said, no person can be made a slave in the eyes of God. So this is not, when I say these things, this is not an indictment on the body of Christ as a whole. It is an indictment on the Church of America in particular, who exchanged the truth for a lie for financial gain.
Mm. 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 Mm.
And there's no backing away from that. And so I as I did today, my cry and my plea and my question is for all of us to realize the things that are being said from the pulpit, and are we complicit in keeping our all of our brothers and sisters in some form of slavery. Um, well, I'll pause there because I know I just like threw out a lot, but
I appreciate all that. And I think, like, for me, the things that stand out, a couple of things, I think that they're tied together. And to me, it's about that. Um, hmm, it's about function and how things function, right? So when it functions for us, back to 1640, when it functions for us, we will communicate the gospel. And when that gospel functions for the ways that we want to function, then we will communicate that. And if it rubs up against any of that, especially our money,
mhm,
then we're not going to be about that. So that that to me is a big piece, and it just makes me question it. It brings me back to the ever loving question about the American church. It's the same question that Jesus asked. I think it's one of the pervading questions. I think that Jesus would drive home. Will you serve money or will you serve God?
yes,
And what does that look like? And so
yes,
for me, when I think about some of the ways that we are still othering people, some of the ways that people are still discriminated against, excluded from leadership, excluded from meaningful participation, um, whether those people are gay, whether those people are people of color, indigenous, whatever people are being, whether it's women in some places, it's just, to me, it's just interesting. Which is, I mean, it's sad to even say. Like, I don't like saying interesting. It's
right,
it's 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 just, it is thought provoking, it is pausing, it's shocking, but it's also, it just calls me to a halt to say, like, so what is this about?
right,
Does this place, and I think of anybody listening, it's like, does the place that I am currently growing, pursuing God, does this place, um is it what is it functioning to do? What are the values that are driving the thing?
yes,
Which I think is a big ask. I think because unless you're being excluded, a lot of times you aren't aware because the system is built for you to some degree.
mhm,
Um, and when you've just been raised up around the thing, back to like fish in water, it's like you can't tell a fish what water is. It's just they they're just in water.
right,
Back to the Matrix and what you said about, like, where you just exist in the matrix. You're just in the matrix, and you don't really realize how much in the matrix you are, um, tasting it and all that kind of stuff. And I think I'm trying to think of. I think I was listening to Brene Brown in one of her recent Dare to Lead podcasts with Aiko, I think, who's just an incredible human being out in Atlanta, I think. Um, but there, I think she was talking about the matrix in that way. Um, it's just around you, you're just in it. Um, it's really interesting. So to me, I think that's that piece about what does this thing function to even do?
Right. And we have to ask questions. We have to um, value history, not worship it, but we have to value it and research it so that we know the pathway that we're going, because we all are born into um, whether we want to call them bubbles or realities or whatever they are. We're born into what we assume is truth, and we're not aware of what existed prior. And so we make assumptions based on our surroundings. I mean, I was born in South Central Los Angeles. I've lived in California all my life. The first time that I took a road trip, my assumption living in Southern California is that our entire nation is like Los Angeles, and that you just keep driving, on freeways, and you hit another city and another city, and there's more, shopping malls, that everything looks like LA. So it's a rude awakening when I either drive over the grapevine or drive outside of California and realize that everything is not this.
Mm-hmm.
I assumed it was. Um, when I was born, I had 4 sets of grandparents. I thought everybody had 4 sets of grandparents. That was the truth I was born into. Well, nobody explained to me the concept of divorce, and this is why I have 4 sets of grandparents. So I do not, this is why the approach has to be with understanding and love, um, because you can't beat people up um, for their ignorance of what they're not aware of. The
Mm-hmm.
goal is to provide thought-provoking discussion that helps you see what you haven't seen before, because we all have blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
We all have the things that we don't see, and we all um, have the capacity and even the tendency to block out the other when we're not aware of the other, or because of what's subconsciously been fed into us. Um, Something that was alarming. I was listening to this podcast, and um, the the narrator began making the statement about um, what he learned in school and social studies about the 3 classes of man. And as he's reciting it, it was like a trigger. It came out of my mouth the same time as he was saying it. Oh, the 3 classifications of man are Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. And I just like, oh, that
Mm-hmm.
this was in me, because the way I said it was the way it was taught. Now, not only is this not a scientific fact, but what else did it teach? It taught that the hierarchy is Caucasoid, Caucasian, Mongoloid, everything that was not black, and then Negroid. And what's the thing that you don't want to be? You don't want to be black, because based on the laws that were created prior to our Constitution and immediately following the establishment of our nation, to be white equaled freedom, to be Negro or black equaled slavery. So you didn't want to be in that other category. Yeah. So, yeah.
There's so much I feel like that's there. Um, I'm just I appreciate that conversation as a starting point. How do we build empathy and understanding? I'm thinking about um, some ideas about the church and the original church. Working on a sermon, and about the responsibility of what it means to be mature, even when it's just when you are the slave people, the Jewish underclass, but you start to model this incredible unearthly love and generosity for your neighbors, and neighbor includes everybody. You start to honor the image of godness in every single human being, so much so you're sacrificing for them, you're committed to them before they're committed to you, just like Yahweh has modeled for you and that you've seen modeled in Christ. And so I'm just thinking about what that means, for people, like the real rubber meets the road when we have the conversation. How much tolerance do we have?
Mhm.
um yeah, what would you speak to some of that?
Uh, one of the things that I have to lean into is, I know this sounds so old school church. What God says I am, I am. Well, okay, if we say that, God says that we've been given the ministry of reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
And that in the verses above that, it says that Paul says that we view no man from a worldly point of view. So I I have to trust that within me is this ministry that God has given me, and I need to I need to flex that muscle. I need to learn how to use that muscle. Um, that I have the ability within me to transform an enemy into an ally. And many times I found it's not that the individual changes; it's my perspective and perception of that individual that changes. Um, if I go looking for a fight, I'm going to find an enemy. There's an amazing book um, called The Anatomy of Peace. Uh,
Mm.
I love these books that are written as stories, and as you're reading the story, you learn these truths. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the title is the premise of the book is so simple that in this story, um, you learn whether you have a heart at peace or a heart at war. And I remember just the communication of that one theme, people would go, "Ooh, I need to read that," because that was easy to communicate. Um, it's published by the Arbinger Group. You can find it on Amazon. But man, I read it constantly. I read the story over and over that this Muslim and this Jew found common ground when they were at once upon a time enemies, and they teach reconciliation to others. Especially in the story, it's how they teach reconciliation to parents who are at odds with their children and teenagers. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing. It's an amazing story that is so transformational. And every time I see a group of people read it, and they because it's hard to like read it, like one chapter and go, okay, I'll read a little more next week. You just like you chew through that thing, and you're usually done in less than a week, if not a couple of days. And then when you see somebody who's read it, they're like shaking their head, man. The Anatomy of Peace, woo,
Mm.
because you can't escape that. You have to find your way to a heart at peace. I can have people be against me, but I can still have a heart at peace towards them and not a heart at war. And one of the examples that they give is how uh, like two nations or two tribes could be at war, but how the general of this one army was not. He had a heart at peace. He saw people. He didn't see the enemy. And
Mm.
so when he won battles, he treated these people humanely. Yeah.
So this general, there's a different way of even being at war when I
Yes.
can see human beings,
Yes.
and it's not just about taking this land, accomplishing this thing.
Right.
It's human beings.
Right.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I'm
yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead.
No, I'm saying the capacity. to see people. Um, I there are people who do heinous things. Uh, there are um, there are people who ignorantly or intentionally want to bring harm or bring destruction.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, we are all called to see those individuals as the Imago Dei.
Mm.
We are still called to uh, see them as individuals who are worthy of love,
Mm.
worthy of justice, and um, and I have to find the pathway to have a heart at peace towards that individual.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I absolutely love that. I'm gonna read the passage
okay.
from Genesis, and then we'll just kind of talk through some of those implications. We've already talked through a lot of them, but I think just to hear it, and I'll maybe frame Genesis a little bit too, from a kinship standpoint. But I really appreciate what you said, even already, is that, I mean, I guess we always do have that choice. How are we going to engage in this? What is this going to mean? How are we going to do it? Um, and there is, like, we can limp along and we can be wounded and we can respond and we can react from our wounded place, but that image of God place is a dignified place. And that's where we find this passage from Genesis. It's written by a people who are currently in captivity, and there are all these origin stories circling around the people that are around them, and they are um, asserting their origin story. Speaking to this comic fanatic, they're asserting their origin story in the midst of all the other origin stories.
Mhm.
And so your gods might think of human beings as seeds to be torn apart and spread around the world, but this God, our God, is different. Our God has breathed God's very essence into our nostrils, made us in God's image. And so this was like that counter story. And I really appreciate that on the backdrop of what you said, because there is a counter story. And I will always be a victim if I'm like, I'm a minority, which I hate that word minority. I don't want to say it right. I'm
Right.
a African American male. I'm multi-ethnic, but which is, and now I have to like educate, da, 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 da. But this story dignifies me higher. And so I can operate from this place. And it's not about like class and me trying to climb that ladder to the different class of human and all. It's just like, no, no, no. I'm acting in the way that God would act,
Mhm.
because I'm made in God's image, and God would love before they love me, and God would be gracious before he would be committed. God would be committed. So that's where we find this passage in Genesis, and they're writing about what's happening and the ways that God creates and what was there, what wasn't there. And then there's this moment in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and it says, then God said, let us make humans in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Verse 27. And so God created humanity in God's own image. In the image of God, they were created. Male and female were created. Mm, mm, mm.
Mm. Mm.
I think what feels like, what what do you think? What comes to mind when you hear that this time around?
I think dignity.
Oh,
I hear dignity. I hear that, um, and I think this goes back to one of the very first things I said about sharing my story, and what God was trying to get through to me is I I'm not an afterthought. That there was something very intentional about my existence.
mm,
I'm not an aimless wanderer looking for purpose. but I was intentionally designed. Being the geek that I am, the comic book pop culture person, who when you go to Comic-Con, you start looking for collector's items, and what makes them collector's items is because they're rare, that there's only so many of them, um, and which were the ones that are most expensive, the ones that are one of a kind.
Mm.
And humanity, and each one of us, we are one of a kind, and so there's a sense of not ego, and I think that that's the thing, when ego gets in the way, um, so whether you know Jesus was saying you can't serve God and money, or God and mammon, or God and ego, but whatever it is, the two cannot coexist. You cannot be spiritually mature and emotionally immature. It does not
Mm.
work. It does not
Whoa.
work. It's a form of godliness, but it has no power thereof. It's false
Mm.
pretense. And so, and I know I've shared in the past about uh, betraying ourselves. We know when we betray ourselves. Now it's so easy to blame somebody else. We can say, I am so sick of this person, and da 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 da, and how they've inconvenienced me and everything. But at the end of the day, our anger is really not about how this individual betrayed us, but how we allowed ourselves to betray ourselves. And this happens all the time. And so then um, we take these things out, our frustrations out on other people, when intrinsically we know that we made a decision to betray ourselves. And so our anger is with ourselves, but it's projected at others. And many times people have said this, and in my own life I found that to be true, that oftentimes the people that I try to distance myself from, or the ones that I'm the most irritated with, are reflections of the things that I'm irritated with about myself.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
So I mean, didn't this is pretty much what Jesus was talking about? Before you try to take the splinter out of somebody else's eye, will you get that telephone pole out of yours? But we treat the other person as they're the ones with the problem. They're the ones that got the telephone pole. No, it's you, buddy. You
Mm.
got that big old plank in your eye.
Mm. Mm.
Uh,
Mm.
and so, yeah, coming back to your question, um, when there is dignity, when you hear that you were handcrafted by God, that you were uniquely designed, that you are a one of a kind special edition in this thing called humanity. Um, as what God said to Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1, before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you, I ordained you, I established you to be a prophet to the nation. And Jeremiah, knowing that this is Almighty God saying this to him, doesn't say, oh God, this this is amazing. That my purpose existed before I had parents, and my purpose existed before I had problems. No, Jeremiah says, I can't do this. I'm just a kid. And that this goes back to what's in the driver's seat of my perceptions,
Mm.
because there was something in the driver's seat of Jeremiah's perceptions where he could not, even though God was saying this to him personally, he didn't believe that it was possible.
Mm.
So I have to surrender myself to this bigger meaning of the Imago Dei, that that I'm handcrafted by God. I'm a special edition, not out of ego, but out of love.
Mhm. I love and appreciate all that, and I love and appreciate who you are, because you've lived that. I mean, you've done the journey. You have expressed yourself in the ways where you've seen passion come alive, and you've chased those things, and you've done the work. Back to what you said about spiritual maturity and emotional maturity, you've done the work to be emotionally mature, and you've done the work to be spiritually mature. I think when you share that about, to me, those scriptures really resonate with me. The masterpiece, Ephesians 2:10,
Yes,
Jeremiah,
yes,
Psalms 139, these places in scripture that honor the dignity that give more language and more specificity to what is declared here at the very first chapter of the very first book.
Right.
But there's also a place in me that's very reticent or hesitant,
Mhm.
because I can just, my sisters and my brothers, people who, like, it's so much easier to believe something different, to believe what our wounds would tell us, to believe. For me, it's like some of those spaces where I have been really marked by my childhood, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I think I've talked about this, but Saturday after Saturday and birthday after birthday, or that moment where, like, for me, it was my father said he would be there and didn't show. And every time it was declaring, oh, you are not worth my time.
Right.
Oh, you back to, so Genesis, right? This passage we read says, you're made in God's image. You are worth everything. Then we go to, like, split the middle of the book. And then we see this demonstration of commitment and love on behalf of Christ that would just be on the cross and declare, you mean everything to me. I will hold nothing back from you, whether
Right.
you believe or don't or whatever. I commit to you, and I want you to be able to believe in yourself. So I will do this thing that hopefully will spark trust and belief in you when you feel like there's no possibility of belief. But I am just like, so I love those passages, and I'm just sitting here like, how do we get to that place? Like, what does that mean? How do I get to that place when, like, in a pandemic, right, anxiety is creeping in and telling me there is no way, and depression is creeping in, and my job doesn't value me, I don't feel valued or whatever. It feels like so much easier to believe the other things. And I don't understand. So for me, and it becomes a question about, like, how does that unbelief function? Is that me not believing that allows me to be mediocre? Does it allow me to kind of wallow, and then I can feel like okay about maybe not living up to my potential? I'm not sure. How would you respond to that?
Ooh, I think about ooh, so many thoughts, but the first thing that came to mind is the Pixar movie Wall-E.
Mm,
And when the director creator was talking about the film, he said that the ultimate message of Wall-E, the concept, the idea behind it, is that unconditional love trumps life's programming. And the thing that you see with Wall-E, Wall-E is the Christ figure in that film. He has unconditional love. And if you notice that any person or any machine that he comes in contact with, even for a short amount of time, something about their programming changes. The robots have a specific task, but then when Wally encounters them, then they wave. That's outside of their programming. That's not what they were programmed to do. And so there has to be. I mean, I hear you, Mark. I mean, I even face this now. There are times and situations where I realize I'm on a precipice that can either lead to my breakdown or my breakthrough, and it's fear, and it's fear because I'm listening to the other narrative that has been programmed in me from birth. There's what God has programmed me to be before I was even existed in my mother's womb. But then there are the narratives that I have experienced in life that try to create another story. And the fight is letting go of those false narratives, and embracing what is true.
mm,
Um, to use another Pixar movie as an example, the movie Up. If the first 10 minutes of that movie doesn't wreck you, I don't know what else does. Um, but that's the sense of our own mortality, and that life is over and you didn't get to that place that you promised that you were going to get to. You didn't get to Paradise Falls because life kept interrupting. What are you going to do? And this is where motive, um, and these other narratives come in, because Carl Fredrickson is so set on getting to Paradise Falls that he betrays himself. He betrays who he is.
mm,
And he doesn't realize the mistake that he's made until he's sitting alone in that house, and Russell has gone on to uh, to rescue the bird, and
Mm-hmm.
he opens up the book. He never turned the page. If he had turned the page, he would have seen what Ellie wanted for him was not to get to Paradise Falls, but to have adventures of his own. And he realized the story is not over. We need to turn the page. How many times in my life have I been in a place where I thought, this is the end of the book. My life is over. Whatever God said he had planned, it's been interrupted. It's dead. It's
Mm,
gone.
mm,
Who
mm,
told me that? Did God tell me that? No. But this other narrative told me that. And I, um, probably the last thing I say about this is you need help. And whether that is the practice of silence, there's going back to emotionally healthy spirituality, there's a 40-day devotional that kicks my butt every time I go through it. But one of those devotions state that everything that you need from God is found in silence. Now, I'm a person that loves adventure, people, sight, sound, noise, everything. So silence is not me. But then I have to trust that deep within me, I am wired to be connected with God. And as I have practiced silence, I have heard and seen some of the most transformational things, especially during COVID. Because
mm-hmm.
now I'm getting up and I don't have any place to drive to. And so I'm taking walks and I'm quiet and I'm talking to God and I'm listening. And then when I see these terrible injustices happening and I'm grieving, God is walking me through my grief. That every morning he's showing me this is what you're grieving about right now. And I remember one of my greatest fears was when my father dies, I didn't know how I was going to respond. I felt like it was Star Trek. I'm going boldly where no man has gone before. I'm in this ship. I have all of these supplies and all of these weapons. I have a crew, um, and the audacity that I figured that whatever is on this ship is enough to take me into the unknown. I have no idea what I'm going to encounter, but I'm so sure that whatever I have on this ship is enough, you know, for whatever I encounter. Um, and I finally reached this point of surrender and saying, I've done everything within my power to do. I just need to rest and trust because I don't know where the unknown is going to take me. But when these injustices started happening, and when I was grieving and God was speaking to me, there was one day after George Floyd's death where God said, "You always wondered and you feared what was going to happen to you when your father died, and now you know." You know how to hear my voice. You know how to hear my voice so well that you are in tune with your body when you are grieving. And you know how to sit and be still and listen. And so now you know that there's nothing to fear. Now you know that I'm with you.
Mm,
And then my father died.
mm,
Um, and it doesn't mean that we don't grieve, it, but there wasn't any more fear. There wasn't any more apprehension about the unknown. I could just rest with God and let God guide me through it. And I think that that's the place where we all, in order to get to, back to your question, you have to find whether it is therapy, whether it is a spiritual director, whether it is quiet time, whether it's just a walk in nature. Um, my place is the beach. I always feel that God is present with me at the beach, but wherever that is, be proactive about that, and God will guide you and help you see the things that enslave you or have enslaved you, and then help you to see that those things don't have any power over you anymore and that you can move forward. Um, and at that moment, you'll think, I just beat Goliath. This is until the next one comes along.
mm, mm, mm.
And then you have to remember how you got through that past one and that will get you through this one. because the next cross is always going to look bigger than the last one. So,
Mm.
that.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely where we finish. There's so much responses, but I just think that was, I mean, just clear, and there's actionables there and invitations there. But I think we building those practices that orient us to that unconditional love, the love that changes us somehow, and those doing whatever those things are that orient us towards faith, hope, and love, those practices that, and those transform us. They transform us against our programming, against all the experiences that have told us we're not pretty enough, we're not skinny enough, we are not wealthy enough, we are not young enough, old enough, whatever those things are, that we put ourselves in that position to remember our dignity based on the image of God, based on our one of a kindness, however that one of a kindness expresses itself, is extraordinary. That's an extraordinary invitation, Eric. I so appreciate you.
Thank you.
Um,
If I could throw one more thing out there, because I
throw
don't
it.
want anyone to forget this, is you have to have a community um, that will love you through your blind spots. And you have to be intentional about trusting that community to call out your blind spots, knowing that they love you and are not there to harm you. Um,
Mm,
I I didn't just get here on my own. There's a whole community that got me here. I am resilient because of the people in my life that I trusted not to harm me but help me.
mm,
Um, and everyone needs a community. Everyone needs those people that they can see you at your worst, and you know that they're gonna give you their best, and you have to trust that, and that when they call you on stuff, that you are accountable to that.
mm,
That you don't do this by yourself. This doesn't happen by yourself. Yes, there's learning and there's trust and everything else, but we are part of the body of Christ. That means that you are knit into something that is a living community, a living being. Um, you don't do this on your own.
mm-hmm.
And so I don't want anyone to think, oh my God, Eric, look how you did. No, it wasn't me. It was us. It was God and the community that God placed around me. This
Mm,
is why I'm resilient.
mm-hmm.
We have to be intentional about our honesty and our vulnerability, and um, these soul care and self care practices that we do. Um, yes, there is work that we have to do individually, but we never do that alone.
Mm. That's really helpful to me. It's just a reminder. And I think, like, even in the community piece about the ways that we create community, I think sometimes we expect community to just happen, or we want community to be the thing, but we're not willing to contribute to what that means. We're not willing to be vulnerable. We want to be in an authentic community, but we're not willing to show up authentically or to drive that authenticity, because it feels so risky, and it can be fearful. Um, but I really appreciate that reminder. It's really helpful, and I think it's one of those things that there is no other way. And so you can try to do it on your. You could try to, but until you have said the thing that you think disqualifies you in front of another human being, whatever that is, whatever's been done to you, whatever you've done, and you see those other eyes looking back into your eyes, and they represent, because you can't feel it. Like, we can read about the scripture, all those passages we read. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And God loves me. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. But when you've done the thing, when you've betrayed yourself, when you betrayed your family, when you betrayed your values, and then you're saying, you need a human being to look you back in your eyes and say, oh, I'm a human being too. I've betrayed my values too. I'm still here. I'm still lovable, and I still love you. For me, I'm so thankful for my wife in that. I'm just the ways that she just reiterates and yanks on my worth. I just feel like there are some practices in our lives that tie us to other emotions of whatever things. And there are, maybe that's interesting. There are practices that might tie us to um, not enough, shame, whether that's comparison, whether that's whatever.
Right.
But there are people in our lives that tie us to dignity, who can remind us of the gospel, who can look us in our face and show us the love that we need to experience and feel and taste and touch and see. The idea is great. The words on the page, that's beautiful. We read John 3:16 on a page. Oh, cute. But when another human being could look me in my eyes and say, I get that.
Yes.
I've done that too. I've done that and this and that. I
Right.
lost this, that, and the other, and I'm still here. And there are people who still love me, and I am still lovable. And I made a mistake, and I am not a mistake. So I just appreciate all that, Eric, and I appreciate you.
Yeah. Somebody did that for me uh, uh, just recently, and it was one of the greatest gifts because I was terrified of what was going on with me. Um, and so I sat down with him and I was trying to find the words, and he just stopped me and just took my hand. He said, "Whatever you have to tell me, I I'll, I can't love you any less." And I cried, and then
Mm-hmm.
I just put it all out there, and it
Mm-hmm.
was to be safe in that way. Just with the thing that you just said, oh God, just sometimes we wonder if how we know God is with us. It's through those people.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, and for being a part of this conversation in ways. It's who you are that lands us in this place, in this vulnerable, grateful place, aware of the risks that we've taken or the risks that are ahead of us and the calls to courage that are ahead of us to be truly seen and truly loved and fully known and fully loved. Um, and for living it, you did the thing. You created, you set up the meeting, you sat down, the Zoom, whatever it was, and you were willing to go there. And then this person, back to how do we function, and back to what you talked about, the understanding that precedes sometimes grace, or that connection. And there was a sense of, for him, his ability to, no matter what it is, I still love you.
Right.
And but then also to give you the opportunity to be seen for all the things that you were afraid to be seen for,
Right.
and to hold that and to say, I still love you, and to look you in your face. And I just think that that's so powerful. And I think I understand that a little bit differently on the backside of this conversation about the times where even the invitations in scripture to confession, or repentance, or these kinds of practices, um, confession especially,
Yes.
because from the beginning of this moment where folks sat down to reinterpret this God that we follow, Yahweh, um, this sitting down, um, to be this is the God who demonstrates that first. And just that, it's like so inspiring. It's just a truth that is beyond, I don't even know how to, it's beyond, I can't even articulate. It's just like, and that invitation to, like, that kind of love,
Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah.
it does transform, and it does override programming and
Yeah.
override experiences, and it is transformative. And the more I feel like the more that I learn and grow, the more that I find myself going back to like the core of love.
Mm-hmm.
I think about Mora, I think about different people who,
Yeah.
like, you spend, or Dave, and that you spend your life studying and trying to get to the root, and then like you realize, oh, it was there the whole time. It's still that.
Yeah.
And I just find myself trying to articulate the unconditional, gratuitous, overwhelming, costly, committed,
Yeah.
love of God. And it's just incredible. So thank you, thank you, thank you, Eric. I so appreciate you sharing your story. Eric, we'll probably have to do this again. You have so many stories to tell us about grace, about being known, about overcoming. But thank you for this conversation where you shared about some of the histories that we all sit in and we might be blind to, the histories of systemic racism within slavery, practices that are inherited by the church, the ways that the church has functioned, not in this kind of imago Dei, gospel-y, unconditional love, dignifying way. And then the ways that that looks real, and the ways that we encounter that in a real way through human beings and through being courageous. So thank you, Eric. Follow Eric on Instagram. Uh, uh,
I it's so easy to find me, because it's always been blonde Negro, right? But now I'm, in light of my learning, I'm wondering, can I can I redeem the term Negro, recognizing, like where it came from. But in the meantime, I'm blonde Negro. So
yeah, exactly.
blonde
So
Negro.
yeah, follow him there now. You can find, I don't know if you post these to your Instagram, but he has a ton of really helpful sermons on a New Abbey's YouTube page. You can go to YouTube and search New Abbey Church, Pasadena. And you have to scroll through some pictures to try and find a blonde brother. And there's just so much helpfulness in there. When we sit down in these conversations, for those of you who have listened to this point, just know that we are celebrating, in this instance, we're celebrating Eric's story, and we are remembering the story of kind of how we got to where we are in this place in history, with racism bubbling over in all the places within the matrix. So we honor that, and we want to see that differently. We want to celebrate Eric's story and who Eric is, and the work he's done, and the community around him that has loved him to be who he is now. So we celebrate that, and we just reimagine Genesis 1:27 together, and the unconditional love of God. So with all that said, you have to know that you are loved, and we are family, because we're all made in the image of God. And that's just the way it is. No matter where you're at, no matter what you're feeling, we're family and you're loved. So until next time, know that, and we'll talk to you soon. Peace.
We are family. Get up.